Late in 1944, the Third Army's war had narrowed into a season of short days and long fires. A staff car came too fast along a rutted track and then stopped with a sudden, instinctive violence, brakes biting mud, tires skidding sideways, an aid's hand flashing out as if it could hold the world steady. Ahead, beyond a low rise, the sound was unmistakable. Rifle cracks, the flat cough of machine guns, and the heavier, patient punctuation of artillery somewhere out of sight. And there, impossibly close to it, stood George S. Patton. The front did not resemble the clean geometry of a headquarters map. It was not arrows and phase lines. It was hedgerows chewed into splinters, smoke dragging itself across fields like a torn curtain, and men pressed into the earth because the earth was the last thing that did not betray them. In this landscape, war was not measured in miles, but in inches, an exhausted crawl from one fold of ground to the next, paid for with shivering hands and sudden, irreversible seconds. Officers watched him with a kind of professional disbelief. The Army's most famous general was walking the line as if he were a company commander, boots sinking, coat darkened at the hem, helmet catching a gust that tried to lift it away. He moved with the deliberate tempo of a man who had seen too much to hurry and yet could not bear to stand still. At an age when most men guarded what they had left, he had brought himself to the place where chance ruled absolutely. A private saw him first, half turning in a shallow scrape behind a berm. For a heartbeat, the soldier forgot the cold, forgot the trembling that came from fear and fatigue and lack of sleep. He recognized the profile, the posture, the certainty, legend made flesh. His face tightened into something like pride. Then another crack snapped nearby and the spell broke. The private's hands shook again because fame did not stop bullets, and because if the general was here, the danger must be closer than anyone had admitted. That was the contradiction Patton carried with him like a weapon. He believed presence was power, that men fought harder when they saw their commander share the air that could kill them. But in the arithmetic of modern war, a commander's body was not merely a body. It was continuity. It was the nerve center of an army that could not afford sudden silence. The news traveled backward through channels meant for coordinates and requests, not for alarm. It reached Dwight D. Eisenhower as one more report in a campaign already saturated with risk, quietly worded, calmly delivered, and instantly unsettling. Because if Patton went down, the loss would not be symbolic. It would be structural. Eisenhower understood that, and soon he would reduce it to a single sentence, one that cut through mud, myth, and momentum alike. You're supposed to command. Patton did not go forward out of curiosity. He went because he distrusted anything that arrived at his desk already explained. Reports could be polished, maps could lie by omission, even honest officers could soften the truth without meaning to, shaping chaos into something orderly enough to brief. Patton wanted the war unfiltered. What the ground looked like when it swallowed trucks. What the air sounded like when rounds passed through it. What a tired regiment smelled like when it had been awake too long. To him, battle was not a debate. It was a contest of pressure applied at the decisive point, and he believed pressure was most real when it had a human face. A commander's presence in his mind was a force multiplier, one more weight on the enemy, one more lever on his own men. He had built his reputation on momentum, armored columns that did not pause, decisions made fast enough to feel like fate, an advance so relentless it made German defenders feel late before they even started. At 60, that philosophy lived in his posture. He carried himself like a man who refused to negotiate with age, back rigid, jaw set, discipline worn as visibly as his insignia. The war had hardened him into a kind of instrument, calibrated for speed, intolerant of delay, convinced that hesitation was a form of surrender. Some generals sought clarity through staff work. Patton sought it through proximity. And at the front, he watched the battlefield the way others watched a clock. When artillery bursts lifted dirt into the winter air, he measured distance by instinct and experience, counting seconds, gauging lines, reading the angle of smoke. It was not mere observation. It was competition, as if time itself were an opponent. The war was moving, and he meant to move faster. The engine underneath it was simple and dangerous. Patton feared stagnation more than danger. He believed stillness bred defeat. Men dug in too long, doubts took root, opportunities closed. Better to risk a shell than to let momentum die of caution. Better to be seen than to be safe. But his staff saw the other arithmetic. If Patton were killed, wounded, or captured, the army would not just lose a commander, it would lose its driving mechanism, the personality that turned friction into motion and doubt into orders. An army can replace a man on paper. It cannot easily replace the rhythm he imposes. And so the tension tightened into a principle that would not reconcile itself. Patton went forward because he believed command was personal. Eisenhower, watching from above, believed command had to be structural, and the war would soon force those two beliefs into the same room. Dwight D. Eisenhower had not risen by becoming a spectacle. He was a different kind of soldier, one shaped by rooms full of maps, by railheads and fuel tables, by conferences where the front line was argued over in accents from 3 nations. His battlefield was integration, armies that did not share a language, supplies that did not arrive on time, egos that could fracture a plan faster than German artillery. He commanded not by presence at the muzzle flash, but by keeping an entire coalition aligned long enough to win. He understood exactly why Patton mattered. In a war that could turn sluggish overnight, Patton produced tempo. He could take a stalled situation and make it move, not through paperwork, but through certainty. Soldiers believed in him with a kind of practical faith, because when Patton arrived, decisions happened. Units advanced. The fog thinned. Confusion was treated as a disease, and he acted like a cure. But Eisenhower also understood the price of that medicine. The same traits that inspired men, speed, sharpness, a refusal to accept limits, could slice through the chain of command like a blade. Patton's personal interventions could bypass careful staff work. His forward presence could turn subordinate commanders into audience members, waiting to be corrected rather than trained to decide. And his appetite for risk, admirable in a platoon leader, became dangerous when attached to an entire army's steering wheel. One day, a report crossed Eisenhower's desk. Patton had been near the line again, close enough for rifle fire to be more than background. Eisenhower read it in the quiet of headquarters, where the war arrived as paper and ink. The room did not shake. No smoke drifted through the door, but the logic was immediate and cold. If Patton fell, killed, wounded, or captured, the Third Army would still exist on the order of battle. It would still have divisions and corps and trucks. Yet what it would not have was momentum with a personality, and replacements do not replace that. In coalition warfare, symbols are costly. A commander who treats himself as a frontline emblem may inspire his own men, but he also gambles with the plan that binds allies together. Eisenhower could not afford a war run on theater. He needed continuity, predictable, repeatable command that could survive shock. His authority was rarely loud. It was enforced the way bridges are enforced, with limits, with load-bearing rules, with consequences if someone insists on driving too fast. And now he faced a problem that was not tactical at all, but human and fundamental. What do you say to a man who believes leadership must be seen, right where the bullets are brightest? Patton's belief in presence was not born in 1944. It had been forged earlier, across North Africa's long horizons, through Sicily's dust and confusion, and on French roads where speed became a kind of weapon. Again and again, he had learned the same lesson. Hesitation gave the enemy time to recover. Momentum did not merely move an army, it bent the opponent's mind. When Patton drove his formations forward hard enough, German units did not simply retreat. They began to feel outpaced by events. as if the war itself was leaving them behind. He understood fear as a force that could be redirected. Fear, he believed, worked both ways. If a soldier saw his general near danger, close enough to hear the sharpness of small arms fire, then the soldier's private terror became harder to justify. The danger was still there, but it was shared, and shared danger could turn into shared endurance. In Patton's calculus, courage was contagious, and the commander was the first carrier, so he treated war like psychological engineering. Create tempo, and the enemy's decisions arrive late. Create awe, and doubt travels through his ranks faster than orders. Create the feeling that your army is everywhere at once, and even a strong defense begins to feel temporary. Tanks and trucks mattered, but in Patton's mind, belief mattered first. Belief that the advance would continue, belief that resistance was futile, belief that the man at the top would not accept impossible as an answer. In a forward command post, the effect could be seen in seconds. Patton would step through the entrance flap, mud on his boots, helmet low, eyes already searching, and men would straighten as if discipline itself had entered the room. Radios continued to crackle, maps stayed pinned, but the atmosphere changed. Officers spoke faster, NCOs stopped looking over shoulders. It was not theatrical to them. It was pressure made human, and there was a deeper reveal beneath the spectacle. Patton's charisma became a form of fuel. When gasoline was short, when roads clogged with broken vehicles and exhausted columns, morale could still move men forward. A general cannot refill a depot by sheer will, but he can make a tired unit believe the next mile is possible. In a mechanized army, belief could be the difference between a stalled column and a rolling one. His age sharpened the myth. 60 in a young man's war, he seemed to mock exhaustion by refusing it. If the old general could stand here, in the cold and the mud and the uncertainty, what excuse did a young soldier have to falter? The message did not need to be spoken. It traveled in the mere fact of his presence. But myth has a hidden cost. The more Patton saw men lift their heads when he arrived, the more he began to suspect the battlefield responded to him personally, as if the war itself could be persuaded by his proximity. And that calm conviction, quietly growing, would soon collide with the colder mathematics of command. Eisenhower's philosophy of command was built around a sober idea. A general's first duty is not glory, but continuity. Armies did not win because a single man was brave. They won because thousands of separate actions, fuel deliveries, artillery schedules, engineer bridges, medical evacuation routes, coordinated thrusts, continued to function even when the front dissolved into smoke and noise. Chaos was always trying to cut the system apart. Command existed to keep it stitched together. To Eisenhower, the front line was not a stage. It was a laboratory of chance, where skill mattered, but randomness still held veto power. A shell did not ask who you were. A sniper did not care what your name meant to morale. A sudden skid on a frozen road could erase a career as completely as enemy fire. In that environment, courage was common. What was rare was the discipline to stay where the whole war could be managed. That is why Patton's forward visits troubled him. They were not merely daring, they were structurally expensive. One fragment of shrapnel, one misjudged turn, one aircraft mistaking a vehicle column, and the Third Army's rhythm could be broken in an instant. The loss would not be sentimental. It would be operational. The loss of a pattern of decision-making, a speed of judgment, a personality that pushed the system forward by sheer force. Inside Eisenhower's headquarters, this did not produce theatrical anger. It produced calculation. Aides watched him read, then pause, then choose the shape of the response. In coalition command, words were not casual. Words were a form of discipline, the only instrument sharp enough to cut through prestige. He could not scold Patton like a subordinate officer. Patton was too valuable, too famous, too central to the Allied narrative. Yet Eisenhower's responsibility was larger than any one legend. And then came the deeper fear, one Eisenhower rarely spoke aloud. It was not only Patton's possible death, it was the precedent. If Patton performed bravery at the front, other commanders would imitate it, not always with Patton's instincts or luck. The culture of command could slide toward theater, generals hunting danger to prove they deserved their stars. In a modern army, that was not inspiration. It was fragility disguised as courage. Coalition leadership added weight to every risk. The war was shared across nations and staffs and fragile trust. Losing Patton would not only damage an American army, it would ripple through Allied planning, through schedules already strained, through confidence that depended on predictable surviving command. So Eisenhower's doctrine hardened into a moral tension that could not be avoided. Inspiring men is noble, but safeguarding the command that sustains them, day after day under chance and pressure, may be nobler still. And soon, that belief would have to be spoken directly to the man who thought presence was the point. By late 1944, the campaign's air had changed. The optimism of pursuit, columns rolling east, towns falling in sequence, the sense that Germany was simply retreating until it broke, gave way to something heavier. Winter settled over the front like a lid. Cold hardened the ground, then thaw turned it back into mud. Engines failed, boots stayed wet, and fatigue became a condition rather than a complaint. The battlefield no longer felt like a chase. It felt like grinding survival, one road junction at a time. Uncertainty was everywhere, and it traveled faster than orders. Rumors of German counterstrokes moved through units like a second weather system, whispers of hidden reserves, of armor held back for a sudden blow, of quiet sectors that were quiet only because something was being gathered behind them. Men began to look at the forests differently. They listened longer to distant artillery. Even veterans felt the shift. When an enemy grows silent in winter, it can mean exhaustion or preparation. Patton sensed danger in delay. He had learned to mistrust calm. Delay to him was not caution, but invitation. Time given to the enemy to choose the hour and place of violence. So he went forward again, not as a gesture, but as a method. He wanted to taste the situation directly, as if proximity could cut through the fog that maps and briefings could never fully dissolve. Out there, in the thin light and the smoke, he believed the war confessed its truth. A soldier in a foxhole watched him pass, helmet low, moving with that unmistakable authority, and for a moment, pride rose through the cold. It was not sentimental pride. It was the practical lift of knowing the man who pushed the army hardest was willing to stand where the ground shook. But then the second thought arrived, sharper than the first. If the general was here, the fight must be worse than expected. A commander's presence at the wrong time could feel less like reassurance and more like warning. That was the double edge Eisenhower understood. Patton's visits could raise morale by proving the commander shared the risk. But they could also signal crisis, broadcasting severity without a single word. In modern war, bodies carried messages. Patton's body, famous and unmistakable, could tell men they were in a decisive place, or tell them they were in trouble. Eisenhower needed Patton's aggression, because aggression kept the front moving. But he could not allow aggression to become reckless symbolism, especially in a winter where chance was amplified and the enemy's intentions were unclear. The war was tightening into a season where one misread moment could unravel weeks of planning. And so the belief phase ended with a knot pulled tight. Patton still believed presence was leadership. Eisenhower, watching the winter gather, believed presence was vulnerability, and the battlefield was about to test which belief could survive.
There were reasons Patton's method sometimes worked, reasons even his critics could not easily dismiss. A frontline visit could expose what no typed summary ever admitted, where the roads choked with stalled vehicles, where tank columns burned fuel while waiting for a bridge that should have been finished yesterday, where orders had been interpreted into paralysis by men afraid to be wrong. The battlefield produced friction the way winter produced ice, quietly and everywhere. Patton's presence, sudden and unmistakable, could scrape that friction away. He arrived like a test of reality. A supply officer might insist the ammunition was moving. Patton would look at the frozen line of trucks and know it was not. A staff briefing might describe a temporary delay. Patton would see the hesitation in a battalion commander's eyes and understand it had already become a habit. He believed urgency could be restored by contact, by forcing the problem to show its face. Small failures in war grow into disasters by being tolerated. Patton did not tolerate them. A traffic jam at a crossroads was not an inconvenience. It was an assault on tempo. A hesitant officer was not merely cautious. He was contagious. A misread order was not a harmless mistake. It was a lost day that could never be regained. Patton corrected these failures fast, often with nothing more complex than pressure and certainty. He could turn a stalled situation into motion by sheer force of will, because will, applied at the right point, could make men choose action over delay. In one forward command post, a young lieutenant began to brief him, voice unsteady, words spilling out in the way men speak when they hope volume will substitute for clarity. Patton listened for a moment, then interrupted with questions that cut like a blade. Where exactly are your lead elements? What is stopping them? Who has the authority to move this unit, right now? Each question stripped away explanation until only facts remained. Mud, fuel, enemy fire, confusion. The lieutenant's face tightened, not from humiliation, but from the sudden realization that the war did not care why something had failed. It only cared that it had. That was Patton's gift. Operational triage. He could look at a front and diagnose weakness quickly, then apply pressure where it hurt. He was less interested in comfort than in function. If an artery was blocked, he ordered it cleared. If a limb was sluggish, he forced it to move. His visits could make entire sectors feel as if the clock had started again. But the tool carried its own danger. A commander who dives too deep into the immediate problem can become trapped by it. Fixing a jammed crossing might save an hour, but while he is doing it, the larger fight waits for a mind that should be seeing beyond the next ridge. The more Patton was drawn into details, the more the army risked losing its overseeing brain, an invisible loss until the moment it mattered. His staff understood the gamble. They improvised protection like engineers building a bridge under fire, guards placed discreetly, routes changed at the last minute, movements kept secret. Not because Patton feared death, but because they did. They knew a general can die like any man. A shell fragment does not salute, and that was the unease that followed him forward. Patton could fix a problem in an hour. But in the randomness of the front, he could also create a catastrophe in a second, and the war was beginning to narrow toward moments where seconds decided everything.
Eisenhower's answer to chaos was rarely personal intervention. It was engineered restraint. He built command the way an engineer builds a bridge, not to impress, but to hold under strain. If the front depended on one man showing up to correct it, then the front would fail the moment that man was absent. So Eisenhower delegated with intention, placing authority where it could act quickly, and designing the headquarters so decisions could be made even when the battlefield was moving faster than any messenger. He believed in systems because systems survived shock. Reports were not merely paperwork. They were instruments for seeing across distance. Liaison officers were not decoration. They were the living threads between armies, corps, and allies. Staff work, when disciplined, turned thousands of separate actions into one coherent motion. Redundancy, unromantic, expensive, often mocked, was what kept the machine running when a single link snapped. Patton's forward visits contradicted that philosophy in a subtle but corrosive way. They implied that the system could not be trusted without a hero present. They taught officers to wait for a personality rather than rely on procedure. They made the army feel as if momentum was a gift Patton personally delivered, instead of an output the institution could generate on its own. For Eisenhower, that was not merely a style difference. It was a structural risk. In headquarters, the contrast could be seen in a single image: Eisenhower reading reports in silence while the war screamed elsewhere. Outside the tent or the chateau walls, guns fired, men froze, vehicles burned. Inside, the sound was paper turning, pencils marking, telephones ringing, command stripped of spectacle. It looked almost passive, but the calm was deceptive. This was where the war's arteries were managed, where divisions were shifted, supplies prioritized, alliances maintained, and crises anticipated before they arrived. The deeper truth was one Eisenhower rarely needed to announce. Distance was not cowardice. It was altitude. Only from altitude could the whole battlefield be seen, its shape, its constraints, its hidden dependencies. Up close, a general could solve a problem. From above, he could prevent the next 10. And now Eisenhower prepared to confront Patton, not about courage, because Patton's courage was not in question, but about responsibility. There was a difference between sharing danger and guarding the command that kept others alive. The conflict was no longer merely personal. It was an innovation in leadership itself, heroic command versus structural command, and the war was about to decide which one modern battle could afford. Patton's age was not an incidental detail. It was part of the image the war projected back at itself. In 1944, mechanized battle had accelerated everything: armored thrusts measured in hours, radios collapsing distance, artillery reaching farther than intuition could warn. Yet into that modern velocity stepped a man formed by older wars and older ideas, carrying decades of military identity into a landscape of engines, steel, and sudden annihilation. His body, rigid, disciplined, impatient, became a kind of anachronism moving through a machine age. To the soldiers who saw him, 60 looked like moral authority. It suggested experience that could not be faked, endurance that had already been tested by time itself. If such a man was still here, still forward, still demanding speed, then perhaps the war could be endured. They did not always know his record in detail, but they understood what age meant in a place where most faces were barely out of school. They read him the way men read a weathered sergeant, as proof that something in the human spirit can outlast exhaustion. To critics, the same age looked different. They saw not authority, but risk. A 60-year-old general at the front was one shell away from becoming a strategic crisis. They saw ego as well, the temptation to turn personal defiance into leadership, to keep proving relevance by placing oneself where relevance is easiest to see, in danger. In a war governed by probability, age did not grant immunity. It only increased the stakes of the gamble. The truth could be captured in a single moment, almost too small to record. Patton stepped off a track, and his boot sank into the mud beside the boot of a teenage soldier crouched low behind earth. 2 lifetimes pressed into the same trench line, the old general's leather and polish swallowed by the same wet ground that gripped the boy's worn soul. The distance between them was measured in inches. The distance in years was immense. Yet the physics of the front reduced them to the same vulnerability. There was a reveal beneath Patton's forward presence, and it was not entirely about war. It was about time. To be distant was to accept aging. To remain at headquarters was to admit that his role was now primarily administrative, a matter of paper and telephone calls and planning. Patton resisted that. By going forward, he refused to be old by refusing to be far away. The closer he stood to danger, the more he could tell himself he was still the kind of soldier he had always imagined. Eisenhower recognized the psychology, and it worried him. Aging commanders, he knew, could chase relevance by chasing danger, substituting risk for purpose, proximity for effectiveness. In a coalition war, that impulse was not merely personal. It threatened the stability of an entire command structure. Staff officers began to plan around the unspoken question. Not if Patton was brave, not if Patton was brilliant, but what happens if he doesn't come back? Who holds the rhythm? Who holds the myth long enough for the machine to keep moving? And as winter tightened, the pressure rose toward a simple, unresolved contradiction. Patton's legend depended on proximity, but command, real command, depended on survival. When Eisenhower finally addressed it, there was no theatrical explosion, no shouted anger, no public humiliation. That was not his method, and it was not his war to run on emotion. The message came with the steady weight of coalition command, measured words backed by the silent authority of responsibilities that stretched from Normandy's beaches to supply depots in England, from American armies to British and Canadian formations moving under the same strategic roof. Eisenhower did not need volume, he needed clarity. He framed Patton's frontline visits as something more serious than personal risk. They were a violation of role. Inspiration mattered. Eisenhower understood that as well as any man who had watched soldiers endure winter and shellfire. But inspiration was not the primary function of an army commander. Continuity was. The Third Army was a living mechanism, and its commanding mind was not meant to be exposed to the random violence that treated privates and generals with equal indifference. In the moment Patton heard the words, the sting was not fear, it was constraint. You're supposed to command. The sentence did not accuse him of cowardice. It did something more unsettling. It challenged his identity. Patton had built a philosophy around being seen, around turning himself into pressure. Now Eisenhower was telling him that the job was not to be a symbol at the edge of danger, but to remain the nerve center that kept thousands of men moving and supplied and coordinated. The turning point landed with a hard, quiet reveal. Eisenhower was not protecting Patton's life for Patton. He was protecting it for the men whose war depended on it. Patton's survival was not personal privilege. It was operational stability. In modern conflict, a commander's body was an asset as real as fuel or ammunition, and far harder to replace. Patton's instinct was to argue. Results had always been his defense. When he went forward, things happened. But Eisenhower's method was to end the argument by defining the boundary. A coalition could not be governed by improvisation from its most famous general. It had to be governed by roles that endured beyond any one man's temperament. And in that boundary lay the deeper moral. Leadership is not proving you are brave. Leadership is ensuring your people have a functioning war tomorrow, an army that can still move when chance tries to cut the wires. The sentence hung in the air like a final coordinate. Patton now faced a decision that was not tactical, but existential. Continue the myth, or accept the job as Eisenhower defined it. Patton did not receive Eisenhower's sentence as a simple instruction. He received it as a reduction, an attempt to compress his way of war into someone else's geometry. In his mind, presence was not decoration. It was part of his weapon. Remove it, and you did not merely protect him, you blunted him. He had spent years turning himself into a force. His voice, his certainty, his ability to appear at the point of friction like a hammer finding a nail. Now he was being told, in the calm language of coalition necessity, to become less visible. He justified himself the way aggressive commanders often do, with results. When he went forward, things happened. Roads cleared. Hesitation ended. Subordinates stopped hiding behind ambiguity. Momentum returned, as if the army had remembered what it was supposed to be. When he stayed back, the war felt slower. Not necessarily worse on paper, but heavier, less sharp. Patton trusted sensation as much as statistics. He felt tempo in his bones, and he did not like the feeling of waiting. The conflict showed in small, unguarded moments. In headquarters, his staff watched him pace, steps measured, shoulders rigid, impatience contained but not erased. They had seen him angry before, seen him scold and command and cut through confusion. This was different. This was a man arguing with the shape of his own role. Obedience pulled one direction, self-concept pulled the other, and the staff understood that a general's private tension becomes the army's atmosphere. Eisenhower's staff anticipated the fallout with the same quiet professionalism they used for enemy threats. Patton might comply publicly because he understood hierarchy and could not afford open defiance, but resentment could survive behind the salute. And resentment, in a commander as decisive as Patton, could leak into decisions. A refusal to share information, a sharper tone in a message, an increased need to prove that constraints were unnecessary. Beneath it all was a reveal that rarely makes it into official histories. Great commanders often fear one thing more than death: irrelevance. Death ends a career, but irrelevance erases meaning while the body still lives. For a man like Patton, built around motion and impact, being told to stay back could sound like being told to fade. He adjusted, but not fully. He found ways to be near without being exposed, placing himself closer to the front than doctrine preferred, visiting critical points at carefully chosen moments, letting his presence be felt without offering the enemy an easy shot. The symbol remained alive, but the risk was narrowed by calculation, and so an uneasy balance settled in. The war continued, tanks still moved, orders still went out, but something had shifted between two kinds of leadership. The heroic impulse had met structural command, and neither would ever see the other the same way again. It did not take a grand disaster to prove Eisenhower's point. The front rarely offers lessons in neat, dramatic packages. More often, it teaches through suddenness, through moments that arrive without warning and vanish before anyone can explain them. In the winter fighting of late 1944, a calm stretch of road could become lethal in the space of a single minute. A quiet sector could erupt because a German patrol found a gap, or because artillery observers finally saw what they had been waiting to see. One such moment came like a blink. A brief German strike, or a sudden concentration of artillery, fell onto a forward area that had seemed almost routine. Men who had been talking in low voices stopped mid-sentence. Vehicles turned off engines. The air tightened with that instinctive silence that precedes impact, when the body senses danger before the mind names it. Then the shells arrived, flat, fast, and indifferent, throwing earth upward as if the ground itself had been struck in anger. A shell landed close enough that even veterans went quiet afterward. There is a particular kind of stillness that follows a near miss, not the silence of peace, but the silence of recalculation. Men look at each other as if confirming they still exist. The smell of disturbed soil mixes with the sharp chemical trace of explosives, and for a few seconds, every philosophy of war collapses into the same primitive truth. Survival is partly skill and partly chance. No one needed to say Patton's name for the lesson to form. It shaped itself in the mind with the clarity of a map. Had he been there, had he chosen that day, that road, that forward post, an entire army's rhythm could have been shattered in seconds. Not because the Third Army would stop fighting, but because the pattern of decisions that drove it would be cut away. The loss would not be measured in one dead man. It would be measured in hesitation spreading outward, corps commanders pausing, staff officers scrambling, plans rewritten under stress, tempo breaking like ice. That was the moral pivot at the heart of Eisenhower's restraint. A commander's survival is not personal safety, it is operational stability. In modern war, continuity is a weapon, and the man who provides it cannot be treated as expendable. Patton had believed presence was power. Now the front revealed the other side. Presence also invites randomness, and randomness cannot be managed by bravery. Patton, whatever his pride, could not ignore what chance had demonstrated. Courage does not negotiate with shrapnel. A man can inspire soldiers by sharing risk. but he cannot compel a shell to land elsewhere. The front line, in the end, is ruled by physics, metal, trajectory, timing, forces that do not respect reputations. Eisenhower's distance, once easy to mistake for detachment, now looked like a different kind of courage. The courage to see entire wars instead of single moments, to protect the machine rather than perform within it. And so the climax resolved in a quiet adjustment. Patton's myth survived, his aura, his momentum, his hunger for motion, but it was tempered by an order that recognized the cost of myth and insisted the war could not pay it blindly. When people spoke of the Third Army, they often spoke as if it were an extension of one man's will. Patton's army, Patton's speed, Patton's temper in steel and gasoline. But an army does not move on legend alone. Behind every dramatic arrow on a map sat quieter forces, staff officers working through the night, fuel columns rerouted around cratered roads, bridge engineers repairing crossings under pressure, clerks tracking ammunition by the ton, and radio nets carrying orders that had to be understood the same way by men who would never meet. What truly drove Third Army success was not a single voice at the front, but a machine that learned to improvise without collapsing. Logistics became a form of combat. When shortages arrived, as they always did, staff sections learned to steal time from the schedule, to find alternate depots, to push repair parts forward, to make damaged roads usable again with whatever materials existed. Tempo was not merely aggression, it was administration performed under stress. A unit that could refuel faster, repair faster, route traffic faster, and communicate faster could advance even when the enemy had not been destroyed, because the enemy, too, was a system, and systems break when outpaced. Patton's presence was powerful, but the deeper story was the machine behind the man. The Third Army had corps commanders who could translate intent into action, division commanders who understood how to keep pressure without bleeding themselves dry, and staff organizations that had absorbed Patton's demand for speed into routine. Those systems had to function when Patton was asleep, when he was traveling, when he was simply not there. If they did not, then what looked like brilliance was actually fragility. In one moment, small enough to pass unnoticed in grand histories, a division commander faced a hard choice without Patton nearby. A bridge was threatened, a route was jammed, and the temptation was to wait for guidance from above. Instead, the commander decided, pull one regiment back to secure the crossing, reroute armor along a longer road, accept the loss of a few hours to prevent the loss of a day. It was not glamorous. It was not shouted. It was competence under pressure. The army moved because someone chose responsibility over spectacle. That moment carried a major reveal. The most resilient armies are not those led by the brightest personality. They are those not dependent on one personality to keep moving. When a force becomes too attached to a single figure, it inherits his strengths and his vulnerabilities. It begins to wait for him. It begins to mirror him. And then, in the one moment he is absent, it hesitates. Eisenhower's reprimand, seen in this light, was not simply a rebuke. It was a forced modernization. It pushed command away from theater and toward sustainability, toward an army that could operate as a system rather than a performance. It did not diminish Patton's value. It protected it by making sure that value did not become the army's only engine. Patton adjusted, because he was not incapable of learning. He began to focus more sharply on operational direction, on shaping the broad fight, coordinating thrusts, preserving tempo through planning rather than constant personal presence. His visits became more selective, timed to moments of genuine need rather than habit. In doing so, he preserved himself as a strategic asset, not a frontline gamble. And the irony settled quietly over everything. Patton had built his legend on being seen. But the army that carried his name depended more than ever on him being alive. War has always honored courage, but it does not always define it the same way. In the winter of 1944, two American generals embodied two different answers to a single question. What does bravery look like when the stakes are measured in armies, not in men? Patton's courage was visible, physical presence close to danger, confrontation with failure, momentum forced forward as if time itself could be compelled. Eisenhower's courage was quieter, restraint, responsibility, the willingness to say no to a man the troops adored. Patton's style was made for the front line's harsh simplicity. He believed in seeing the ground, in hearing the guns, in letting officers and enlisted men alike feel that the commander's standards were not theoretical. His courage was kinetic. It pressed against fear and forced movement. In a war where paralysis could become a habit, his presence acted like a shock to the system, reminding men that the purpose was advance, not survival alone. Eisenhower's battlefield was more complicated, and therefore less forgiving. He lived inside a coalition where every decision echoed across national pride, competing plans, scarce shipping space, and political expectations. His courage had to function in rooms where the enemy was not always German armor, but disagreement, impatience, and the temptation to please. For him, bravery often meant absorbing criticism without the relief of action. There was a micro moment that captured it. Eisenhower heard complaints about caution, about delays, about decisions that looked unheroic on the surface. He did not answer with speeches. He absorbed them in silence because he knew that the unromantic decision was often the one that kept the coalition coherent. In war, you can win a battle with daring. You can lose an alliance with one careless indulgence. Eisenhower's restraint was not passivity. It was maintenance of a fragile machine. The reveal beneath that restraint is one most people only learn when responsibility becomes real. Restraint is often harder than action. Action offers glory, even when it fails, because it looks like effort. Restraint offers only blame, because it can be mistaken for fear. To tell a famous commander to stay back is to risk being seen as timid by the very men you are trying to protect. Eisenhower accepted that risk. He chose the burden of appearing cautious in order to keep the war running. Patton's forward instincts in this light were not foolishness. They were a philosophy shaped by earlier wars where visibility mattered more and battlefields moved at the speed of horses and shouted orders. In such worlds, the commander's body was often the communication system. Presence was command. Patton carried that inheritance into a mechanized age, and it had genuine power. Men did fight differently when they believed their general shared the air that could kill them. Eisenhower's correction was not timidity, but modern command, an adaptation to a front too complex for one heroic body to govern. Radios, artillery, air power, logistics networks, allied timetables, these were forces that required altitude more than proximity. The modern general's heroism was not in standing closer to bullets. It was in ensuring the bullets could be managed, anticipated, supplied against, and survived as an institution. And that is where the moral settles. War rewards bravery, but it is governed by roles, and roles must be protected. A commander can inspire by sharing danger, but he also carries an obligation to remain, the obligation to keep decision-making alive when chance tries to cut it off. The front line will always hunger for heroes it can see, but armies survive on continuity they rarely notice. In modern conflict, the highest courage may be refusing to gamble with other people's dependence on you, choosing to live, not for comfort, but so the machine of war does not lose its mind at the worst possible moment. In the end, it was not the mud of a particular field or the smoke of a particular morning that endured. It was a sentence. Eisenhower's words, plain, almost austere, outlived the immediate argument and became something closer to doctrine. You're supposed to command, not because a general is too precious to risk, but because an army's continuity is too precious to gamble. Commanders in every era feel the pull of symbolism. The battlefield rewards what can be seen, but the war is won by what survives. Years later, veterans would remember the shock of encountering Patton at the front, as if the famous profile had stepped out of a newspaper photograph and into their frozen reality. They would remember how the line straightened when he appeared, how voices sharpened, how fatigue briefly retreated. For a moment, it felt as if the war had been organized simply by his presence. And then they would remember the other truth, how quickly feelings fade when bullets start again. Inspiration is real, but it is fragile. It burns bright and then disappears into the practical demands of staying alive. A man's courage can steady you for a minute. A functioning command can steady you for a winter. Patton's age, too, takes on a different meaning when the story is viewed from a distance. 60 in a young man's war is not merely a statistic. It is a human struggle with time. Patton had spent his life preparing for a moment like this, and when it came, history accelerated. Machines, radios, supply networks, coalitions, decisions made at a scale that no single pair of eyes could fully hold. He was still decisive, still hungry for motion, still convinced that war could be imposed upon the enemy through will. But he was also fighting something else, the fear of becoming a relic while the world moved on without him. That is why the temptation to go forward is so old. To stand near danger is to feel relevant. To hear rifle fire is to feel connected to the truth of war. To be seen is to confirm that you still matter. Patton's forward movement was not just strategy. It was identity in motion. Eisenhower's message, then, becomes the final reveal of the story. A general's duty is not to share danger, but to manage it for others. Not to prove bravery, but to preserve the structure that allows bravery to matter. The men in the mud were already paying the price of war with their bodies. The commander's obligation was to ensure their sacrifice served something coherent, an operation that could still function tomorrow, a plan that could survive the randomness of the next shell. The moral irony tightens until it becomes unavoidable. Patton went forward to lead, believing the highest form of leadership was to be seen where the risk was greatest. Yet the highest form of leadership, in Eisenhower's view, was to stay back, far enough to see the whole field, safe enough to keep the machine alive, disciplined enough to accept that glory is not the same as responsibility. And the quiet truth remains, long after the winter roads have thawed and the hedgerows have grown back. The front line is always hungry for heroes. It wants a figure it can point to, a face that makes suffering feel meaningful. But armies are hungry for continuity, for command that does not vanish with a single burst of fire, for decisions that arrive even when chaos tries to sever them. Patton went to the front to prove he was still a warrior, until Eisenhower reminded him that the war needed him more as a commander than as a symbol.